In his short life, Alan Miller always sustained a central focus of interest on Japan. This probably has something to do with the fact that while he was still an undergraduate at UCLA in the late 1970s, his childhood friend Michael Orsenstein introduced Miller to his future wife Miyoko on a double date. Miller's dissertation from the University of Washington was on religion in Japan, and after he spent a few years on the American academic scene, he decided to move with his wife and make a career in Japan. A radical decision, but one that apparently he never regretted. This article appeared after he had established himself in the sociology department at Hokkaido University and shows how he was branching out into comparative international research in the final years of his abbreviated career. A few years after Alan Miller from Florida State University worked with John Hoffman from the National Opinion Research Center in Chicago, Miller found himself spending some time at a university in Japan. This exposure to another non-Western culture got him thinking about the cultural framework that he and Hoffman had taken for granted in their first article. So he began looking into whether their earlier findings were limited to a particular cultural setting, or perhaps might be generally applicable to different religions all around the world. He remained concerned with the basic question of whether we might think of getting involved in a religion as a form of risk aversion, similar to Pascal's famous conclusion that it is only logical to bet that God exists because you have a lot more to gain if you're right than you would lose if you were wrong, and God didn't exist. If religiosity can be thought of as risk avoidance, that might explain why women tend to be more religious than men. In the 1995 article with Hoffman, Miller found some support for this connection between religion and risk aversion in the survey responses of a sample of U.S. high school students. But when he got to Japan, he realized that it might be a good idea to find out whether this connection was unique only to the Christian religion. The combination of Buddhism and Shinto religions in Japan seemed to approach life quite differently, so the same sort of linkage might not apply there. In fact, once he started thinking about this, Miller decided that he needed to develop an even more comprehensive comparative perspective and explore possible connections between risk and religion for several different major world religions. He wanted to include not only Christianity and Buddhism, but also Hinduism and Islam. In fact, he also decided to consider differences between Protestant and Catholic Christianity while he was at it. Now, it might be possible to find groups belonging to all of these different religious traditions within a single country like the United States. But he rejected that approach because he wanted to look at people living within a whole cultural context where each different religious tradition occupied a dominant position, shaping the general public attitude. He would need to find information not only from his home in the United States and from his current residence in Japan, but from other countries as well. Fortunately, Miller knew about a very ambitious collaboration that had been going on for a number of years already, involving social scientists all around the world. This global effort involved designing a core set of questions to ask people, based on the theories and existing research developed by this international group of scholars, and then translate these questions into lots of different languages, select representative samples in lots of different countries, ask all these same questions in each place, and then compare the results around the world. This massive effort is still going on today and is known as the World Values Survey. You can even search out the results from these surveys on the internet for yourself and do any kind of original research that you would like using this publicly available archive of information. Miller decided to dig into the World Values Survey data and base his comparative research on that empirical foundation. In the process, he discovered that he could not only make the comparisons that he wanted, but also that he could improve on the measures that he used in the earlier research with John Hoffman. For example, Miller and Hoffman measured risk-taking or risk aversion using a question from their survey of U.S. high school students that asked about wanting to go on adventures and another that asked about being afraid of dangerous situations. These questions were pretty good for considering the kind of risks that would come up most often in the lives of high school students. but such questions would not be very good for other periods in the life course. Miller wanted a more general question about risk that would be more applicable to people of any age. The world values survey data that he found, however, had a great question that gets at the more abstract general idea of risk. It refers to any kind of situation at all stages of life and asks whether a person thinks that in general you should be cautious about the decisions that you make, or whether you should act boldly to get the most out of any situation. Possible answers ranged from a score of 1 for being the most cautious to 10 for acting in the boldest manner, so higher scores can be thought of as a measure of willingness to take risks in life generally. The World Values Survey also gave him an opportunity to improve on measuring religiosity. The original study of high school students used just a single question about how strong the respondents thought they were as members of the religious group with which they had identified themselves, a question about religious attitudes. The global data set includes lots of questions about religiosity, and Miller decided to include 4 of them and to see how his considered factors, including risk-taking, did in predicting responses to each of the 4 items. 2 of these concerned religious actions or behavior, whether a person had joined a particular religion as a member, and how often the person attended religious ceremonies and services. The other 2 questions concerned religious attitudes. One asked how important religion was as a guide in the person's everyday life, and the other asked how much the person's religious faith and beliefs provided a sense of comfort and support when facing challenges or problems. Beyond just wondering whether his original findings would show up again in different religious contexts around the world, Miller actually started out with a hypothesis about where he would find the original pattern, and also where he would not expect to find it. In particular, he expected to find a link between risk-taking attitudes and religiosity only when the dominant religion in that society made it clear to believers that there was only one right religious answer to questions about God, the afterlife, and so on. Western monotheisms like Islam and Christianity, including both Protestants and Catholics, insist that there's only one God. Their holy books, the Bible and the Koran, both agree that there's only one true path to God and to salvation in the afterlife, although they disagree about which path is the one true one. In this context, Miller concludes that we can certainly see religiosity as a way to make the safe bet of Pascal. Not taking these religions seriously means taking a big risk on eternal life in paradise. He is not so sure that the same logic applies in the case of the Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. We might argue with his theology on this score, but he feels that the connection between religion and risk might be different in these latter cases. We'll see how this works out for him. Results of Miller's analysis from World Values Survey data appear in a series of 5 successive tables, one for each country that he studies. We will start with this table 2 for survey respondents from the United States. Here, Christians predominate in the population, but are split between Protestants, half of all people, and Catholics, another third of all people. This, then, should be an example of religiosity as risk avoidance, as he and Hoffman found in their earlier paper. These regression results do not include a constant or intercept for each of the 4 models shown in the columns, but we can just keep in mind that in all of these tables, the coefficients in the first 2 columns predict probabilities of belonging to a religion for the affiliation column, and reporting that religion provides you with comfort for the comfort column. In both cases, the only possible answers are 0 for no or 1 for yes. So these scores reflect different proportions of 1s for yes for the named categories. Most importantly for our current topic, both of these columns show very strong negative values for men compared to women. Men are about 1/3 less likely to say they belong to a religion, and also are 1/3 less likely than women to say that they find comfort from this affiliation. In the third column, coefficients show how much change we should expect on a 4-point scale from religion being not at all important to being very important to respondents. Again, men are significantly less likely than women to say that religion is important to them. Finally, in the fourth column, we see that men have scores for religious attendance that are about a third of a point lower than for women. This result is barely significant because this is a third of a point on an 8-point scale, going from never all the way up to several times a week. So despite the size of this coefficient, it is the least significant result in the row for men. We need to keep in mind that the significant contrast between men and women appears here even after we have also taken into account how old people are, since religion increases with age, how educated they are, and how much income they enjoy. The table also includes coefficients for each religious outcome for the effect of a 1-point shift along the 10-point risk-taking scale. As Miller expected, all of these risk coefficients are negative, and all of them are statistically significant except the first one for simply saying you belong to some religion. This confirms his hypothesis that in a predominantly Christian society, people who are risk-averse also tend to be more religious. But this row of coefficients also means that we have accounted for this fact of some people being risk takers while others are more risk averse. This means that the remaining difference that still survives in the sex equals male row of the table has nothing to do with men being more likely to take risks, because all of that effect appears in the bottom row of the table. The sex equals male effect has to be interpreted as an additional tendency for men to be less religious even after we take out their greater taste for being bold instead of cautious. Pascal's wager is certainly not the whole story here, even if there is some evidence of it. By comparison, Table 3 for Italy gives an even clearer confirmation of pretty much everything that Miller would expect from a predominantly Catholic country. Nearly all the predictors in all the models are statistically significant. Increasing age always predicts more religiosity for all 4 different ways of measuring it. More educated Italians are less religious in every way. So are Italians who make more money, which is pretty much the same thing. The coefficients for risk preference are all negative, as Miller guessed would be the case again here for Christianity, and all of them are statistically significant. For every point higher scored by Italians on the 10-point risk scale, religiosity tends to be lower. These coefficients are quite similar to the negative coefficients in the United States, suggesting that Pascal's wager is having a similar effect in both populations. But most interestingly for our current topic, the negative coefficient for being male instead of female, even after we take out any effect of people's risk preferences, is also still statistically significant for all 4 ways of measuring religiosity. In fact, these coefficients are sometimes twice as large in Italy as they were in the United States. This means that there's something else about being a man versus being a woman in Italy that sorts people out on religion, making religion more of a woman's thing in Italy and making men less religious. This much wider gender gap in Italy must be due to something else besides risk preference in Pascal's wager, and the much higher coefficients for Italy compared to the United States suggest some kind of variable social origins for this gender gap, rather than any sort of innate biological difference between men and women. If it were innate, it should be the same for men and women everywhere. Finally, it's very instructive to move on and consider Table 4 for Turkey, where virtually everyone in the population is Muslim. For Americans used to thinking of Muslim societies in fairly stereotyped terms, these results are eye-opening. Of course, here is precisely where it would be very helpful to have the model intercepts presented as well as the coefficients for these different predictors. All of these coefficients show predicted variations for the named factor from some default reference category of people. This default category includes people with average age, education, and income, who are female, and who have average scores on the risk preference scale. The constant or intercept terms for this group might have been different in each of the 3 countries. In fact, the reason why we see so little variation for the listed variables in any of the columns of Table 4 in Turkey might have been because these starting values for the default reference group were already so high in Turkey that there was not much room for any variation up near the top of the scales of religiosity. Still, Miller does find confirmation again for his guess that in Islamic societies, as in Christian countries, a monotheism that insists that there's only one right answer in religion translates into Pascal's wager for some people. so that those least willing to take risks score highest on all four measures of religiosity. Only 3 of these risk coefficients are significant, but all are negative as expected. More importantly, for our current focus on gender, though, none of the measures of religiosity are significantly different for men than for women, except only reported frequency of attendance. Despite their privileged place inside mosques, and despite all the pictures shown in Western media of crowds of exclusively men in rows touching their foreheads to the floors in mosques, Turkish men score an enormous deficit of almost 3 points lower than women on an 8-point scale for attending religious ceremonies. The participation of women in Islamic religious ceremonies in Turkey must be quite unphotogenic because we never see pictures of that. But all the other measures of religiosity show no significant difference between Turkish men and women. This again deals a heavy blow to our stereotype of Islamic societies as bastions of contrasting sex roles. Compare this row of coefficients for men to that from Italy before you take your leave of this section of Miller's paper. We turn now to the other 2 countries for which Miller examined responses in the World Values Survey, starting with India, where the predominant religion is Hinduism. Based on his own interpretation of what Hinduism teaches, he suggested that people might not think of religious involvement as avoiding any kind of spiritual risks. Miller thinks that the path to nirvana, the closest we can get in Hinduism to ideas like heaven or everlasting life, depends mostly on how Hindus live their everyday lives, not so much on whether they observe particular religious rituals or go to religious ceremonies and events. I'm not so sure that Hindu religious leaders would be comfortable with his interpretation, because those rules for everyday living that are so important still come in the first place from Hindu teachings. But it is true that you don't have to join the Hindu religion. You're pretty much born into it automatically. It is also not a religion that aims mainly to comfort people in this world, which is seen as a hopelessly corrupted place that is doomed to keep getting worse in the future, so the comfort question is not very relevant either. At any rate, Miller does not expect to find a strong link between religiosity and risk preference in India, because he doesn't think that Hinduism dictates that Hindus are facing a choice like Pascal's wager. This expectation turns out to be true. The coefficients in Table 5 for risk preference are all negative as usual, but this time they are all so small that none of them can be judged as significantly different from 0. Older people are still more religious in India, and people with more education also are less religious, but income differences, just like risk preferences, don't tell us much about religiosity there. But most importantly for our current emphasis on gender contrasts, the men from India report less religious involvement on all 4 items, and this deficit was significant compared to women for all except the affiliation measure. That lack of significance for affiliation is not surprising, since everybody with Hindu parents is automatically considered to be Hindu. Here again, even after we take into account age, education, income, and also the risk preferences of people, men still come out as much less religious than women. Since Pascal's wager does not appear to matter in India in the first place, none of this religious deficit observed in Table 5 has anything to do with risk preferences. Once again, this is about some other difference between men and women in Indian society. Results for Japan, shown in Table 6, tell another completely different story, very different from India. In the first place, an extremely large share of people in Japan simply report no religious affiliation at all. Nothing in that first column of the table makes any difference to this lack of interest in religion, except that older people do report more affiliation with religion. This could be something that increases with age, or it could also mean that these are people from an earlier historical generation when religion may have been more important in the past. This lack of predictive power carries across all 4 dimensions of religiosity for education and income in Japan. These things never matter at all, and people's indifference to religion seems to cut across all these boundaries of social class. Risk preference also has nothing to do with religiosity in Japan, again as Miller expected. He expected this result partly on the strength of how he understood the teachings of Buddhism, but this could also be partly because no kind of religion is important to Japanese people. We would have more information about this again if the model intercept or constant would have been included at the bottom of each column to compare with constants in other countries. But the one exception to this general lack of predictive power again turns out to be the sex equals male row in this table. Once again, all of these coefficients are negative, and all of them show that men are significantly less religious than women. Once again, as for India, Pascal's wager doesn't even enter into the picture, and these negative coefficients have nothing to do with risk preference. They are about some other difference between men and women. In this case, by far the largest religion deficit for men finds them denying that they find comfort in religion when facing challenges or problems. The male deficit on this measure is greater in Japan than in any other considered country. So, after 5 different sets of results from 5 different countries, where 4 different world religions have dominant roles in shaping religious views of life, what have we learned? First of all, Miller's original guess turns out to be right. The idea behind Pascal's wager that people might be drawn to religion if they don't like to take risks only works in the 3 countries dominated by Western monotheisms of Christianity and Islam. People only face the choice Pascal posed for them if the religious landscape around them includes only one correct path to the ultimate goals promised by that religion. In India and Japan, risk preferences drop out of the picture and have nearly nothing to do at all with religiosity. Second, in all 5 countries, we find at least some support for the importance of the other factors that Miller had to take into account. Older people tend to be more religious, while more educated people with higher incomes tend to place less importance on religion in their lives. And at the heart of our focus on gendered experience of religion, even after we subtract out of the picture all the effects of age, education, income, and also risk preference when it matters at all 5 countries display large, statistically significant deficits in religiosity for men compared to women, no matter which dimension of religiosity we consider. Everywhere we look, the least religious people tend to be young men, and the most religious people tend to be older women. If we line up all of these religiosity deficits for men, as measured in different countries for different dimensions of religion, we also see that although men seem generally less religious than women, the details of these patterns vary from country to country. Overall, Catholic Italian men show the greatest consistent religious deficit across the 4 considered measures. On the other hand, the Muslim Turkish men show virtually no religious deficit compared to women, except for a huge gap in reported attendance at religious events. Men mainly lag behind women in admitting that religion might be comfort to them. Other differences are smaller. There are 2 ways we can try to come to terms with these varying results across countries. First, we could try to think about things in each society that might explain why men are less religious in different ways. Second, we could try to think of reasons why men and women in each country might answer survey questions about religion in ways that might systematically distort how they really feel privately. They may not be telling the survey interviewers everything about how they feel. For example, Japanese men may be particularly unwilling to admit to someone else that they even need any comfort when faced with challenges, let alone that they look to religion for it. The same might apply to men in Italy. When thinking about gender differences in religious experience, we have to keep in mind that we're always looking at such experiences through the filter of what people have reported to the interviewer conducting these surveys.